Invitation. It's really exciting to be able to share my work with colleagues in the department. Because there's quite a big research project, I just thought I would give more of an overview of what's going on, and then it will be hopefully be the basis of some interesting discussions, because I know some of you are, some of the foremost experts in this kind of stuff as well. So um, to start with, Wired magazine reported that with the rise of AI, artificial intelligence has become what they call an engine of wow. And I've just put some AI generated pictures here because in my house, so many of my pictures are with my Dachshunds. When AI generates images of me, it's always with Dachshunds. So that explains that. Um, AI can, read brain scans more precisely than human doctors. It produces creative outputs that outstrip most humans. And to the annoyance of many of us lecturers, it also is writing many of our students' essays. But AI's capacity to perform all of these tasks relies on a hidden supply chain of physical infrastructure, of data, and of human workers. Now, 80% of the time spent on machine learning projects is actually not highly trained engineers working at Google or Microsoft, but rather poorly paid, low skill, and often repetitive and mind-numbing work known as data annotation or content moderation. So content moderators are the workers who manually sort through social media posts, trying to remove toxic content and flag violation of the company's policies. And data annotators label data with relevant tags so it becomes legible for reading by computer vision algorithms. And so together, I call these types of jobs data work or data workers, which encompasses many different types of behind-the-scenes labor that makes our digital lives possible. And so here's some of the tasks that you might see such data workers do. Putting bounding boxes around objects for autonomous vehicles to see, or working with more complex systems such as the one on the left, which is called a LiDAR system, which relies on light detection to determine distance and velocity. So to start with, the research project that I undertook, one of the data workers that we came across in our research was called Mercy. And I think, is that Callum? No. Callum is in one of the other projects. I undertook this with Callum and a team from Oxford University. Now, Mercy lives in Kibera, which is one of the largest slums in Africa, just displayed here, just on the outskirts of Nairobi. And she works as a content moderator at a center for one of Meta's partners. So she works at an outsourcing center with a company that has a contract with Meta to undertake some of its content moderation work, because the company wants to push this as far as possible from public view. Now, Mercy must action one post every 55 seconds on her 10-hour shift. And this, to give you a feel for what this is like, this is some of the most gruesome, horrifying material that humanity has ever produced. We're talking about suicides, rapes, child pornography, literally anything that the internet decides to put online. Now, on this particular occasion, Mercy recounted to us that she was moderating a video of a car crash. And she looked closer at the victim in the front seat and realized that it was her grandfather. He had just been fatally killed in a car crash. And Mercy was the first in her family to learn about this by moderating one of these toxic social media posts. And what's more, working conditions at her moderation center, pictured here, were so bad that her supervisor didn't even let her go home after the incident. She had to finish her shift. And so for the remaining 4 hours of her shift, she was exposed to this toxic content as different people posted about this incident again and again and again for the rest of her shift. Different angles, videos, photos. It was right in her hometown. Now, Mercy's story was a really particularly upsetting case, but it is indicative of the intense and really quite horrible working conditions and poor job quality that's faced by millions of data workers in various locations across the global south, from Kenya to Madagascar, from Venezuela to the Philippines. And workers like this are laboring in essentially modern-day digital sweatshops. Shifts are long, pay is low, and workers must meet very demanding targets for speed and accuracy in their work, or fear of having their jobs and the contracts moved quickly to another overseas location. And so the research project that we undertook is part of a project of critical AI studies and its attempt to understand the underlying systems that produce this type of work and those that benefit wealthy American tech companies in the global north at the expense of workers across the globe. So to do this and to kind of interrogate these systems, what we propose is that we don't understand AI as an engine of wow or as this marvelous and miraculous gee whiz machine, but rather as what we call an extraction machine. And so when we engage with AI products as consumers, we only see one surface of this machine, right? We only see the outputs. But beneath this polished exterior lies a complex network of various components and relationships that are necessary to power it. The extraction machine draws in all of the necessary inputs of things like capital, of natural resources, of human labor, of data. And it's able to transform these into statistical predictions, which in turn AI companies are able to generate profits from. And so we want to show that AI is an expression of the interests of the wealthy and powerful who use it to further entrench their position and reinforce their power, while at the same time further embedding a lot of society's existing biases and unfairnesses into new algorithmic and digital forms of discrimination. And so this little diagram here is really trying to find ways of interrogating the system by understanding what we call the AI supply chain. That actually beneath these kinds of systems we know, just as we understand the supply chain of Nike shoes or our cup of coffee that we have in the morning.
Oh, leaving.
Oh, sorry, we've just got someone.
To get the balance.
Hi, could you, yeah, you've muted. Great. So just as we understand the supply chains that make other consumer products necessary, part of this project was about trying to understand what an AI supply chain looks like and what are the necessary inputs that go into that. So we've got here the kind of physical infrastructure side of things, the critical minerals and materials, you know, the copper, the silicon, all of these components that kind of go into the data centers and the chips that power AI, and the human labor and other components that are necessary there. So the first thing that we wanted to highlight here is the material and physical infrastructure, right? The ongoing electricity and water supply. In a lot of countries that have a very intensive and heavy data center industry, places like Ireland and Iceland and others, data centers are using as much electricity as all, consumer households combined. People are estimating that the capacity or the requirements for electricity are going to double in the next couple of years for data centers. So this is a huge ongoing material resources in addition to this human labor. But we also want to highlight the ongoing human labor that is necessary for AI to function. And in another article that we've done, we talk about what's called the AI data pipeline, that the kind of content moderation and the data annotation processes isn't something that will be left behind or that is a kind of small part of what's otherwise very automated processes, that at every step of the way, when you're thinking about training these AI models, you have very complex and iterative processes of data collection, of data curation, of labeling and annotating the data sets, and of continually checking and retraining and fine-tuning the model, right? And this all requires people to do all kinds of work that is incredibly labor intensive and that is often outsourced because otherwise it would be so expensive to do. So this AI data pipeline is another theoretical tool that we use to try to emphasize and to further understand and unpack the really enormous amounts of human labor that go into this. So the emergence of the networks, or the production networks through which AI is made, we argue echo colonial histories of extraction and exploitation. Colonialism therefore becomes one of the central concepts for understanding and interrogating AI today. So in this project, I draw on the decolonial school, or the modernity coloniality school, of Latin American scholars who seek to understand colonialism's ongoing effects in the present. And so while, colonialism is often understood as a historical term to apply to a kind of, historical empires that no longer exist in their current forms, rather these Latin American scholars talk about coloniality as a certain structure of power, or a certain series of relationships that exist post-liberation. And they're talking about the kinds of hierarchies in knowledge, in the different forms of labor that are available to people, in systems of gender and race that still structure how work and everyday life is undertaken today. And so I draw on a lot of these scholars in order to try to further interrogate the kind of way in which AI is deployed in the present. And so the argument here, which I can state, but I don't have a huge amount of time to kind of go into every detail, is that a system of coloniality is part of the structuring logic of artificial intelligence, both in how it is produced and the supply chains that it requires, but also how it operates and the kind of knowledge production activities that's engaged with, the kind of biases that exist in its data sets, the kind of work that it allocates to different people, and in the outputs that it produces. So one of the central concepts of this project is thinking about an international division of digital labor, in which different tasks are distributed across the global workforce, with the most stable, well-paid and desirable jobs located in key cities in the United States and Western Europe. And the most precarious, low-paid and dangerous work is often exported to workers in various peripheral locations in the global South. And so the Latin American decolonial school is really coming out of and drawing on the world systems theory, which really highlights the way in which the global economy is concentrated around a set of core countries, and that they're supplied and depend on a set of peripheral countries that supply more raw materials and labor to make the global system function. And so you can see that being traced into how AI works today. And so a lot of these practices for how AI chips are produced, how data sets are annotated, are really following very well-worn colonial patterns of Western countries leveraging their economic dominance and growing rich off extracting minerals and labor from these peripheral territories. Furthermore, outputs from generative AI also reinforce older colonial hierarchies, since much of the AI data sets and the benchmarks that are used are trained on data sets and forms of knowledge that privilege Western ways of knowing and reinforce a lot of harmful stereotypes that we've seen. And even if the developers are putting up certain guardrails to try to minimize the harmful racist and sexist depictions that AI can produce, it's all contained in the data sets, right? So it's very hard for them to eventually overcome that in any meaningful way, because it's really just mirroring and reproducing the kinds of power relations that already exist in broader society. So by understanding the colonial histories of AI, we want to draw a line from the technological development of current AI systems right back to earlier forms of labor discipline and industrial production on the plantation, in factories, and show that there are these great continuities between these gendered and racialized forms of exploitation. And we think nowhere is this link between the colonial past and the synthetic present more apparent than in Kibera, in Mercy's hometown, the worker that I presented at the beginning of this research project. And so when we visited Mercy in her hometown in Canberra, we spent some time walking along the kind of train tracks that go right through the slum. And this train track is part of what's known as the Ugandan Railway. And this is a kind of railway that goes from the port of Mombasa in Kenya right through into Uganda. And it passed through, it was built in the late 19th century by the British Empire as a way of projecting their power into the continent and creating economic opportunities, and really trying to enhance their power in that part of the world and prevent other colonial powers from kind of coming into their territory. And so as we walked along these railway tracks, you can kind of see, exactly where these connections lie, because the very port of Mombasa, where this railway came through, is almost the exact same location. Today, roughly along the same route from Mombasa to Nairobi, lies one of the fiber optic cables. Now, this was first laid in 2009. And this was a moment that connected East Africa to the digital global economy through this submarine fiber optic cable that really changed the way in which Mombasa and Eastern Africa could contribute to and participate in the global economy. So if you look at this kind of map, you can see that the connections between these new generation of fiber optic cables that connect roughly at the same point. And it's no coincidence that this kind of happens. It's these kind of shallow, often calm and gentle areas which old shipping routes used to see as very convenient for ships that would ship, spices, slaves, gold, silver, and other goods across empires, often the very same points that are very convenient for fiber optic cables to be laid today, because they require a kind of smooth exit from the sea to the land. And so from here, we can see, the real connection, because, this cable that connected East Africa basically allowed for a new sector of businesses to emerge in the Kenyan and Ugandan economies. People call this the BPO sector, or business process outsourcing, but essentially it's, Western companies that are shipping a lot of their back-end work to be able to be completed by a very low-wage English-speaking workforce in places like India, Pakistan, Kenya, the Philippines, and elsewhere, that provides this new kind of work that fiber optic cable and internet connection makes possible. And so, you can see here that where there is connection, there is also usually a desire for power and control. And that connection to these circuits of global capital is both an enabling and a constraining feature for Kenyan businesses and Kenyan workers that want to participate in how this economy functions, right? Because they are given new opportunities, but often the opportunities they're given are incredibly exploitative, very one-sided, that really are trying to extract and take out as much value as possible from these workforces while giving very little in return. So there we can see our colleague Callum Cant walking along these train tracks as part of the research trip. And I have a lot more of this project, but I feel like if I start going into more, I get a bit lost. There'll be too many details. So I might just skip. I'll stick at the overview, and I'll just go down to where you can read more, which is here. So there's a book that's coming out based on this in July. And there's a few articles that you might want to look at. The artificial intelligence in the colonial matrix of power is the kind of more theoretical one. The poverty of ethical AI is like a case study of one of these places we visited. And the typology of data work is more like if you're interested in the kind of big picture, what is data work type stuff. Yeah, so I might leave it there. And yeah, because I think there's probably just too much going on. And I think the discussion is always more interesting anyway. So I'll stop sharing and we can, have a chat.
Cool. Thank you for that, James. Very nice. do we have any sort of things just to kick off with talking with James about this? Peter.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Excellent. No, I apologize. First of all, I'm actually in bed because I came back from a trip and I seem to have caught a cold from my son. So we're very socialist here, which I appreciate when it comes to health. I really like this, and obviously we've talked about this before. I mean, I think this was really brilliant. But I had a question. That, well, not a question so much, but maybe seeing how this fits within a broader kind of understanding of the colonial matrix at play here, right? So I think this is very, very cool when it comes to the question of work and AI, right? But I'm thinking about more broadly how this also creates colonialized extractive subjects. And I'm thinking about this in two ways. One is I think that there's a huge, very important part that is starting to happen about how this data is being used and this kind of whole set of physical and digital infrastructures to categorize populations about where they should fit for their own development and progress in this AI economy, right? So you're starting to get really interesting things happening now about saying, okay, well, people in Latin America or people in East Africa, right? Their populations that should be best organized in this way, right? And also you begin seeing this in terms of the quote unquote metropole, in terms of places like even San Francisco, right? Where you have situations about one of the first things they're doing now is saying how they're going to manage different populations and how they best fit within this, right? So I think it'd be interesting to kind of map that kind of, I'd say, more kind of categorizing planning that's happening that I think you can very much link to ideas of previous colonialism and racialization onto this kind of supply chain that you're talking about. The other is, I mean, you mentioned the kind of Latin American modernists, and the person that actually came up here for me was actually Drussel, who kind of talked about the ways in which, the metropole was very much constituted by the ways in which it, quote unquote, was in relation to a periphery for a particular type of myth of modernity. And the reason I kind of say that is because I think that what that works on is actually showing us now how we have multiple, quote unquote, metropoles happening here, right? And I think the West non-West distinction is one that maybe we want to rethink a bit because, for instance, I mean, the surveillance metropole is right now in Israel and China, right? And they are working in East and West Africa every day, right, to construct extractive data populations that they can then use to essentially sell surveillance technologies and data surveillance, right? I would say the more kind of corporate social media one is very much in the west coast of the United States, connected up to East Africa, right? So you see all these kind of interconnecting kind of like I would say data metropoles and data peripheries, right? And sometimes they're in really serious tension with each other, right? So for instance, one of the interesting ones was that there was a real tension between the fact that when Israel wanted to use Gaza as to control population, essentially, for all the technopolies that were happening with in East Africa and West Africa, right? The US wanted to do the same in Latin America, but couldn't do it because the US wanted to dominate that role and they simply couldn't. And that was completely also because of the backing of China, right? Because China was massively funding this. So I think it might be also interesting to look at this as a bit more about how different metropoles and peripheries are starting to be constitute each other and have different hegemonic notions of what this digital type of modernity is that are often in hegemonic competition. So that's all I would say. But I really love this work. I think it's brilliant.
Thanks for your great comments, Peter. I think you're right on both fronts. I think the the project as it's articulated now, or the based on the work that's been done now, is much stronger on the kind of labor input stage than it is on the output stage of interrogating how forms of knowledge production based on AI technology, re-articulating these kinds of older colonial hierarchies. It's something that I cover a little bit in the philosophy and technology article, but something that I think can really be expanded on, and other people are working on that as well. In terms of the multiple centers and peripheries, that is a huge problem for the book as it's currently kind of written, because we don't have fieldwork or the kind of knowledge and expertise on China that would be required for doing this project properly. Because you're right to say, you know, the kind of tools that are most readily at hand from the Latin American decolonial school are really interrogating the European colonization of the Americas and Asia. And you can't directly correlate that to the current geopolitical environment in which there are these multiple centers. And so based on my own limitations and my research team's limitations in terms of knowledge and understanding of what kind of AI is being produced in China and how that works, you know, all we can kind of do is nod to that at the moment. But I think that's a really good place for future expansion, because you're right to say that, you know, maybe about 30% of development in AI is happening in China, in Chinese, with Chinese developers, and that, you know, they have their own colonial relationships with parts of Africa and other parts around the world. So yeah, I think both of those are really interesting areas for further development. And I have only been working on this project for about a year, so I think there's so much more that could be done with it, including those two suggestions that you have.
Right on, excellent.
Phoebe?
Hi, yeah, I'm really sorry. I do have this terrible connection, so I keep actually getting kicked out of the room. So if I disappear again, it's not because I'm somehow running in and out of the room as I would be doing physically, but actually for some reason this is happening. But anyway, hi. I just have a couple of things that I wanted to sort of raise. I'm just curious if there are things you can do as well to even expand and develop these concepts. And one thing that occurred to me is in terms of data labeling, being part of the generation of specific so data that can then be used to create AI, as it were, as you're talking about in terms of a supply chain. So what you're actually talking about is a creation of specific data sets that then are used to create this, as I say, as you are calling it, supply chain. There's also a question of the value chain. And the reason I mention this has to do with, especially if we're talking about content moderation itself, there's a real value orientation around what happens and what decisions are made in that instantaneous moment, and that extraction kind of point around also surplus value. I mean, the value of people's labor. This is the point. I think it kind of links a bit to what Peter's saying, but I think you can go beyond that as well, to do with your coloniality question. And I'm just wondering, because each location has its own criteria for what is considered content that is permissible in the public space in terms of what's on screen. And so, and of course you have there's a whole literature around the psychosocial dimension of the labor itself, the suicide kind of dreams, you know, these kinds of things whereby people are really, this is a different layer of exploitation that's happening in the colonial international space, but there are different ways of thinking about it. So I'm wondering in terms of that kind of dimension of it, because that does have some implications for how AI then only fits to a value orientation or a consideration of what's palatable for the public domain in terms of consumption on the other side of the screen, absorbed by people whose work is frankly violent and should not even exist. And then there's the question of whether AI should be doing it. And I mean, that's another question that we need to ask. The problem though, of course, is that it's very difficult to even find out what companies are doing with the data that is generated in the process of the data labeling, because they don't tell you. And I tried to find out myself. We should talk a bit more about this, because one thing that happened in the Philippines, so there's different orientations around what's considered nudity, what's considered, again, publishable in the public domain. But then that annotation dimension, that means that nudity also has a different connotation. So those are all these kind of different questions that aren't necessarily, you're not gonna be able to answer right immediately, but that's one thing I thought about. The second question has to do with class, because the question is that this work is being done internationally, but it is also happening in Austin, Texas. Famously, there are groups of content moderators who've taken the employer to court and won because of the psychosocial violent dimension around their work. And that's really interesting too. So I'm wondering if there's a solidarity potential for the class kind of composition question, because a lot of the work, but then what does that say about the coloniality point? I mean, these are questions I'm asking myself. This is why I'm bringing it up here, not necessarily we're going to be able to do anything now, but it's really important to me anyway as well, because a lot of this work is happening in the USA and also in Cambridgeshire. You know this, right? The contact centers, there are a lot of people working on the British content in the island, as it were. Anyway, so those are the questions having to do with the value dimension to these questions, the class dimension, and also how do you get that? How can we prove that this is part of some kind of AI supply chain? You see what I mean? We need a little bit of that in order to do it. But yeah, no, so those are my questions, and thanks again. And if I get kicked out, it's not because I'm leaving. It's just because I'm battling with my own Wi-Fi here. Okay, but thanks for really excellent and for your really important work in this, James. It's really cool. So
Great. Thanks, Phoebe. Thanks for those great remarks. You do face a kind of issue as a researcher of like what specific concepts or ideas do you use? We could have used value chain as opposed to supply chain. I think supply chain, we ended up going with that because it evokes more viscerally for a kind of public audience what we're talking about. Value chain is just a little bit more kind of businessy speak, but perhaps you're right to say that maybe value chain is more accurate because we are talking about things that yeah, I guess processes that are kind of producing value in ways that aren't not a replacement, yeah, aren't specifically about providing the kind of raw materials for AI. In terms of the class element, the final chapter of our book actually talks about the different ways in which we might want to think about transnational networks of solidarity between these workers, because you're right to say it doesn't take place exclusively in the global south. It's just a kind of preferred location because of the forms of labor discipline, the lack of unionization in a lot of these places, and the level of the wages that can be paid in places like that. Of course, wages are very low in places in the US and the UK as well. But yeah, you know, I think the question is, does the connection or the shared experience of this type of work of transnational workers better enable them to organize and form these movements? And I will say, you know, there are a lot of things standing against them. You know, it's a very isolating job. It's very hard to connect to people. The contracts themselves, they're often on a contract system. I didn't really get to go into that, but a lot of people are on like 1 or 3 month contracts. So it's very hard in those kinds of conditions to form more permanent networks of solidarity. But I think there are still people that are engaged in that. And that's a kind of very interesting question to pursue further. Yeah, I might just leave it there. Thanks, Phoebe.
Camilla?
Thank you. So thank you. I really like the your presentation and the project. Super interesting. I really like the using the lens of extractivism to look at data, because I think it is very accurate. And if you look at from the global south and kind of past colonial experience, it makes a lot of sense in the sense that, you know, raw materials are still being extracted today in a way, the raw materials as either labor or a actual nature, right? So one thing that I would like for you to maybe go into is see where is nature here in terms of raw material? How is data a raw material? And what is the role of the workers in this way? In colonialism in general has been from the you know, Spanish in Latin America at least was all agricultural at the beginning. So we can think about the workers as harvesters, either of, you know, agricultural products or also minerals, right? They harvest and they are coming from an agricultural background, harvesters need to decide what is good and what is bad. So the bad strawberry from the good strawberry, and you pick it, right? So you are the first selector of what nature has to offer. So can we think about social interactions as kind of the nature of, you know, where data is found, and data is basically the selection made by or the data that is fed to the machine, at least, is a selection of this, right? So what is the kind of the role of the work, if we can see it like this, and if it helps in this way. And then the other is something that you said then in your response to Peter, Peter, was the language zones, because data, because it is transferable, so the raw material could be filtered or harvested anywhere. So basically there's peripheries within the peripheries and peripheries within the centers and everything, but as you said, it is clustered around language, because data has, you know, it needs to be decoded in a way by a specific language. So it would be interesting to move forward in a way and seeing globally how language, you know, could replace other forms or other zones of, you know, the global south that had been, you know, peripheral or in this way. And finally, something that I'm working on that I've been doing, I encounter in Chile, is about participation and the data that is fed to the machine as being free, something that we produce because we want to, right? And in the part of the kind of democracy, it is, okay, we feed our opinions to the polls or to the thing that is pre-done, or we send our raw input in a way to the machine, and then they filter out and they use that as material for their own purposes, right? And what we produce, it's not paid, right? It's completely unpaid. The same as the raw material that is used in any data is not paid for. So it's very similar to the natural resources in the colonial extractivist mode, in which the minerals are nature in a way. There's nobody's owner of this. They extract them for free. What they pay is just the extraction. So I don't know if it's very connected, but I would love to hear more about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camilla. I think you've really struck upon some of the central debates that are happening in critical data studies and in these discussions around AI, and they have so much significance for how you would translate older theoretical frameworks, particularly things like Marxism and forms of colonial theory, onto these kind of debates. Now, the first question, is data raw material? What is the raw material of AI? You know, in this book, we kind of, in a very popular language, we hint at that it is. But I have questions, I have worries or concerns that actually that's not entirely accurate. And I think if you talk to more technically minded people about this, the idea that you would consider data either the new oil of the digital economy or in some sense a raw material is a little misguided. And I think the reason for that is partly because data sets are themselves curated and constructed. And so that process of, there is no such thing as raw data, right? Like that's a kind of contradiction in terms that any kind of data, be it an unstructured or a structured data set, has some kind of work that's been done on it to turn it into that, it exists in a particular file format. It's not like, John Locke and like plucking an apple or tilling the soil or combining your labor, it's like these kinds of naturalistic metaphors are so obviously unsuitable for things we're talking about that exist in a digital environment, because everything about it is constructed and man-made. However, if we want to talk about people like Shoshana Zuboff and these kinds of critics of surveillance capitalism, like there is a sense in which it does kind of, zoomed out to a certain level of abstractness, that it does kind of make sense to think about this as a raw material, right? Because, it's the kind of element that is necessary that is further worked upon in some way. Like there is work that is done on data sets in a kind of roughly analogous way in which we might work the land. And the way in which you think about, well, I think about AI as an extraction machine does rely on this kind of, ability of these technology companies to take from the commons. And I think this is both a physical and an intellectual exercise, right? Because it's really a privatization of collective intelligence. Something that I wasn't able to cover in this presentation was, the theft of literature and art and, digital representation of images, which are all fed into the data sets, right? Like, how do you think ChatGPT works? It's taken a bunch of comments on Reddit forums, it's scraped Wikipedia, it's taken books in the public domain, it's taken some private books, hence all of the copyright claims that are being made against these tech companies, and it's pilfered the work of artists. It can easily generate most artists' work because it's been fed into their data set. So, to that extent, yes, it is using all of this as a raw material, whether or not you want to use that in a very technical way or not. As to your second really interesting point, language, to some extent does determine the various spheres in which these production networks operate. Julian Posada is someone who's done a lot of work on data annotation in the Latin American context. Antonio Casilli and Paula Tubaro and their students are people that have done a lot of work on data annotation in the French context. And of course, the French companies go to Francophone Africa, the British and American companies go to Anglophone Africa. Some of the Latin American companies to operate in the US obviously go to Venezuela and other countries in the region. So there is a certain linguistic divide in how these companies operate. However, at the same time, some of these tasks and some of this activity can cross linguistic lines. Like, you can annotate street scenes with very low level language knowledge. But for convenience and for, the sheer fact that you need to talk to management, you need to, have forms of labor discipline, you want to have easy relationships with these companies that you outsource this work to, a lot of it does, remain very tightly organized around these language barriers. So language, I guess, both is and isn't in that sense, forming these types of divisions in how this work is orchestrated. And then the third thing that you said, Camilla, was just remind me in 2 words.
Extractivist participatory practices. That is kind of like the idea of being free in a way. The data is free because whatever you say is not paid for.
Yeah.
The same as in democracy, that you're supposed, out of virtue and duty, you just need to give your opinion.
So I think here we can draw a distinction between, I think some of what you're referring to is probably like social media activity, but also probably in a more expansive sense of any kind of social activity or act or gesture that can be recorded through some kind of digital device. That, companies like Facebook and Google, basically that's their business model, right? Providing a free digital service and monetizing that through targeted advertising. With data sets and some of the, with generative AI, essentially, they have used a lot of that same activity in terms of trying to take publicly available data sets, sometimes with a legal gray zone as to whether or not they're infringing copyright law. But also some of the data sets they buy, and so particularly when you start to look at other applications of AI, mostly things like autonomous vehicles, computer vision, retail stores, virtual try-on outfits, a lot of that data is bought, right? So they don't necessarily rely on free data sets because it's not good enough. It's not structured enough. So for many AI applications, although it depends on the specific type, the data is they have to buy the data, and they do a lot of work on it, or they buy special curated data sets, or even they get synthetic data, which is produced by an algorithm, right? So rather than going through hours of footage of a street scene, you just pay a company to digitally produce a street scene, and that can help you train your AI models. But yeah, I think the question you pose is a really interesting one, which is to say, to what extent is this what you call participatory activity monetized? And I think for a certain subsection of this, it is a huge question, and it kind of goes back to the debates that were happening in the early 2000s in critical data studies around free labor. There was quite a few, like Christian Fuchs was doing a lot of stuff on that, and there's a famous 2000 essay by a woman, something Terra Nova, I think Tiziana Terra Nova or something. But yeah, it's a really big question. And I mean, can I quickly ask you, Camilla, what is your project that you're doing, which is in relation to this kind of participatory activity?
Yeah, so basically, I was looking at binding and non-binding forms of participation. And one, I was basically labeling extractivist in order to make the difference with the other that was empowering. Because the first one is you basically feed the machine, whatever machine it is, human or not, your inputs for free. And then they do a black box that you cannot control, and they have an output. And then they claim that that output is based on whatever you did. So basically the legitimacy is borrowed from free labor from citizens, and basically it's a form of manipulation, this form of extractive participation. And then they because it is for free, basically you have no power, they push for kind of a virtuous kind of politics. This is going to make everything better, either better for you. So in a way, you need to feed the machine because this is going to kind of feed you better stuff for you, right? Kind of like inputs that are valid in a way. And it's an illusion at the end because there's no control over the curators. So in the sense of if coming from, and you say that the workers have to have a specific, background in a way. Yeah. The people feeding the machine, some of them were very poor and their education was very poor. So they could not express themselves in a manner that was intelligible for the curator. So those samples were just eliminated from the pool. So this is kind of like, I was there. So I basically talking to the person that did it. And this is like, yeah, we had like this percentage that we could not even, it was so badly written basically that I could not, So it's incredible how the class, going back to what Phoebe was saying, the class distinction or the class bias within it is very interesting too.
Interesting, yeah.
So I'm going to call myself here. This is probably a naive question, James, but I'm curious about, is there a thought through specifically, I'll call it maybe ideological dimension of how AI is represented? So thinking here of the classic Marxist notion of the hidden abode of production, or basically commodification erases labor, right? And a lot of what you're describing is when people talk about AI tools, they aren't thinking about all these data encoders and all this labor. So it almost seems like it's just disappearing even more labor. And is that like thought through by the people who are doing it? Like, oh, this is a curious, a nice way to disappear that labor, rather than saying, our ongoing colonial relationship to these data centers and people doing all the data work in all these places. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So I think I can visualize this through the Mechanical Turk. Have you heard of that, Stephen? It's like great. So it's just for everyone else, it's a fraudulent chess playing machine, which I can't remember which century it was. I'm presuming probably the 18th century. It sounds like an 18th century thing, in which a small chess grandmaster was hidden in a box and would, through a series of mirrors and levers, could make it appear as if a Turk, a figure, a wooden figure could play chess on its own. And so this machine toured Europe and would play chess people and kind of amaze everyone. And it's actually what Amazon Mechanical Turk, the crowdsourcing platform, is named after. And so to bring this example up is to say, the point that, look, here you have a seemingly automated, seemingly intelligent system that in fact relies on the hidden labor of human beings. And therefore it's like a great metaphor for AI. We want to deepen and extend that, because I think that's basically like level one. That's like where you first realize that, hang on, this is all just done by people. This is all manually annotated. And so much of this is just people coding data sets and making sure everything, goes smoothly. I think step two is an analysis of the power relations and the long histories, which are inevitably colonial, that structure these kinds of relationships, and looking at the political economy of these companies and how did they come into being? How did they get funded? Where did California's IT system come from, right? What are those processes? And inevitably you end up with a critique of global capitalism. Of course, all roads always lead to a critique of capitalism, but I think to really research the empirical details of that and to understand precisely how these systems work is kind of the goal of the project. And in my mind, we're just at the beginning of that, because we were able to essentially, you know, what Peter said, trace one form of how that happened from a couple of particular Silicon Valley companies to a couple of particular East African data annotation companies, tracing a bit of the histories of those regions, understanding how those networks work. But like, to really do it justice, you know, you need to go way back further. You need to look at a much more expansive global system. In the book that we've done, we have actually done a little bit more. So we've looked a lot at artists, we've looked at data centers, we've gone to a few different other locations. But, you know, there's always limits as to what one person or one group of people can do. So yeah, the short answer is I think you want to get an analysis of colonialism that goes beyond just the man in the box, because the man has a history. Like, why have we called the player a Turk? Why is that racialized, you know, language so relevant to how the system works, and how do those processes of racialization affect contemporary divisions of labor in AI?
Thank you. Cool.
Thanks so much.
Do we have any other questions for James, or should we call it a, well, not Dave, call it a pause? Okay, well, I guess then we'll leave off there. Well, thank you very much, James.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much, everyone, for engaging with my work.
Thank you. It was great.